So obviously, we're here just to learn a little bit more about stalking, and just wondering if you could give us sort of your big perspective on stalking, what it is in your opinion. We know what the statute is, but just sort of how you tell someone, more of a layperson, of what it is, how often you see it, how you think it impacts victims, or just whatever.
Well, it's interesting because my learning curve has been so sharp over the past couple of years that not only do I continually learn how little I do know, but the fact that I've come into learning about stalking in a unique way gives me a good perspective for the difficulties victims often have for identifying it in their own lives. If professionals can't identify it, and I don't know, to me that says a lot about why we shouldn't blame victims for having difficulty putting words to what's actually going on. But if I was explaining stalking in my position, it would most likely be a victim that might have described to me things that were red flags or, seemed clearly indicate stalking to me, but because of the way they were describing it, I can tell that they wouldn't necessarily call it that. And you're in a unique position when that happens because first off, you don't just get to label it and then there's the answer for the victim. You in fact have to be quite cautious that you don't bring them to any kind of conclusion before they're ready to get there. So instead, if what they've just described to me in discussing a domestic violence situation, for instance, an example might be where I've had a victim tell me, after a crime has taken place, they're describing the history with that partner, and they're saying things like, well, they showed up everywhere I went. Sometimes it made me wonder if how they could figure out where I was going. And for me, having been through training, I'm thinking of things like trackers on cars and all the many ways that we now know that people can use technology to aid in their stalking behaviors. But I'm certainly not going to scare that victim to pieces by saying, well, they probably had a tracker in your car and that's stalking and here you are, because you have to, only help them. You can only help them if you're giving them information that they're ready for. So instead it might be, well, how many, when you're saying it felt like they always knew where you were, would that be like daily they'd show up somewhere? And when you give them a little bit of that, wow, they just start giving you more information and more information, and that additional information can take you further to where you're really thinking they're just describing classic stalking. But again, you want to bring them slowly. So the next thing might be, well, they'd show up every time I left work, no matter where I went, they seemed to be there. Or one of them has described to me, I later found out that the apartment next to me was empty and that he'd go in there and be listening through the walls as to what I was doing or who I was talking on the phone with, and that's how he knew a lot of my plans. These are huge stalking behaviors, but what that victim was describing was something that was already a realization they came to on their own after a bad incident had taken place. So, again, you have to be so careful because to put words in their mouth also can feel to them like blame of you should have known, you should have seen. So it's just real treacherous waters in that the victimization of domestic violence, intimate partner violence, stalking, the victimization is so great that the victims have suffered. It's so fearful, there's so much isolation there, that the last thing any of us as professionals working with those victims should do is to add to any of that self-blame, add to any of that fear, add to any of that idea that the problem is too great to be addressed. So you just kind of have to work with a victim from where they are and help them identify things in a slow but consistent manner. You still don't also want to become an enabler of saying, no, you're right, it's not a problem, because you're not helping then either, which is kind of why it's such a fine line.